Good morning and welcome to Washington Main Street's Economics Trends and Opportunities on Main Street webinar. I'm Brianne. I'm the director of the Washington State Main Street program. As you're coming online this morning, I just want to give a quick shout out to the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. We run the state program on their behalf. I work for the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation, which is your statewide preservation nonprofit. And just to throw another long name in the mix, we have funding for this particular webinar from the USDA. So thanks for all the support that's allowing us to provide this today. This is part of a three-part series. We wanted to engage Main Street leaders at this particular moment in time because there has been so very much effort on your part to keeping your businesses viable over the last 6 months, to bringing your community together. And we want to provide you with some resources and a bit of a mindset shift as we do look ahead to the future and try to approach recovery from a proactive standpoint, whereas we have by necessity been reactive for the last 6 months. So that's the nature of this conversation today, is to look at that through the lens of economics. And with us today, we have Trip Muldrow of Arnett Muldrow and Associates and Matt Wagner from the National Main Street Center. Both of these guys have been very good friends to Washington Main Street over the years and really important leaders in our movement for even longer. So we're happy to have them with us today. And with that, I'll let them introduce themselves before we get going with our dialogue. Go ahead, Matt. Sorry, I should cue you up.
Okay. It's like the two chipmunks in the Disney. No, you go first. No, you go first. No. Hi, everyone. Good to be back in Washington, even if it's only virtually. I enjoyed, I think, a couple years ago where I was able to come out and do some training with Brianne, and it was great to meet many of you out there. So thanks for having me, Brianne. And again, my name is Matt Wagner. I'm the Vice President of Revitalization Programs at the National Main Street Center. Been there for about the past 5 years. And most of my career has been, in somehow, some way connected to the world of downtown revitalization, starting out as a Main Street manager myself in Sheboygan Falls, Wisconsin. And we were very proud to be one of the first GAMSA winners back in 1995. And that's when I went off to the National Main Street Center, my first go around. So I'm a boomerang back to the center, and really have enjoyed the opportunity to come back about 5 years ago and work with many of you. And certainly, I know that Trip shares this as well, as I think this conversation, while certainly this are challenging times that all of you are facing and that small businesses around the country are facing, but we certainly feel that there are some silver linings out there. And so I think our philosophy on this conversation will be to look towards the positive, even amongst the biggest challenges out there. Thanks for having me.
Hey, I'm Trip Muldrow with Arnett Muldrow and Associates. We're based in Greenville, South Carolina. We have an office in Milford, Delaware as well. And like Matt, my whole career has been in the downtown revitalization, urban revitalization arena. I started out in the city of Greenville, South Carolina in economic development. And then the other part that I'm sort of a geek on and is retail development. I did my master's thesis comparing retail in the United States to that in the United Kingdom. And I've done lots and lots of retail studies all over the country. And one of the funniest things about the session that you're seeing today is that Matt and I have orbited around each other for 20-something years and have never met. Yeah. And so it's like finding my soul brother, because in up the session, it's like, yeah, what he said. So there may be a lot of that. There may be a little, bromance going on here during the session. And for those of you who don't know, I've been working in Washington State now for about 11 years, all over the state, from around Seattle Metro to Gig Harbor, Hey Mary, to the eastern part of the state. And I see lots of familiar names, and I also see Sherry there from Oregon. So it's just really great to be a part of this conversation. Look forward to swapping ideas and knowledge and what Matt and I have learned and sharing it with y'all and then doing Q&A. So.
Yeah, thanks both of you so much for being here. I truly have already forgotten that you just met in relation to getting these webinars set up. And we did structure this as a conversation. And when the three of us were talking a few days ago to prepare for this, one or both of you said that if anybody comes at you with economic trends and opportunities in this moment and has a lot of graphs and says, I know exactly what's going to happen, you shouldn't believe them. So just that's sort of the setting of this, is that, you know, we are approaching this with some uncertainty, but know that both of you have spent a lot more time than most of us diving into the data that is available, and appreciate you coming to have a conversation mostly with each other about what's going on in our world right now. And this is all sort of also in the setting of, you know, last week we talked a lot about mindset and really about the value of Main Street in this moment. And if you didn't have a chance to hear that conversation between Tripp and Norma, one of Matt's colleagues at National Main Street, certainly encourage you to go back and listen to that. A big part of it is just really owning that Main Street, the model, is really important in economic development right now, especially because of the relationships that you all have. So taking good ownership of that and then really trying to package that value and owning that leadership that you all have as we move forward. And with that, we want to have a good grounding too in the economic realities that we're in so that we can make good decisions locally. So from the bird's eye view perspective, you both have, Matt and Tripp, you know, what is happening in the economy right now? And would you say it's as bad or worse, or that's a horrible question, Brianne, compared to what you might have thought several months ago? Go ahead.
All right.
Who's on deck?
I think she said Tripp, right?
She said me. Okay.
Yeah.
I think a few months ago, when this came out, none of us expected this was going to be as long of a slog as it is. Okay, so that's probably the negative end of things. The positive piece of this is we're starting to see the resiliency come through. One of the themes that I think is really important as we are in mid-September, heading in October, and is understanding that we've kind of reached this phase where this is kind of where we're going to be for a while, you know, and I'll talk a little more too about kind of, well, and we also know, if anything, what COVID has done is accelerate retail trends that were already happening before. And so that is, and that's not a graph or a chart or anything. It's kind of like, you can look at the metrics on things like online shopping, at delivery, at, you know, how we communicate and mobility and all those data points. And what we've done is we've advanced a lot of those trends that were taking years into just a period of a few weeks. And so that's the other piece that I think is worth talking about. But, you know, Matt, really, he's got his finger on the pulse of this too. So I love
I would say yes, yes, and yes, and yes. And sort of the added pieces, I think, to that is, and what we had a conversation earlier about, is that there's this, you know, all of us, because, you know, you're exposed to lots of media source, it tends to be sort of more macro. And we make a lot of generalizations about what's happening in the economy, but most of the lens that's used for those generalizations are largely either from national, you know, retailers, and you hear about the closures there, or more perhaps from urban markets. And so I think, if anything, because there was not necessarily a national response, it was consistent across the board. What you really have to do, and I think we all have to from a Main Street perspective, is that you have to localize what's occurring there. And so you may read a headline, you're like going, that's not jiving with here. And that's really no surprise. So, you know, I think the takeaway at this point, and what Tripp alluded to, we're probably in this sort of cycle for some time, but your cycle may be slightly different than someone else's. And so just like we've always said in Main Street, you know, look at the downtown as in terms of what your unique aspects are. How are your consumers reacting to shopping, to eating out, to going to events? May be completely different than somewhere else. So I think, you know, the takeaway, at least at this moment, is to, yes, learn from some of those things that you're hearing from a trend perspective, but, you know, ensure that that's sort of being reflected at your local level. And if not, you know, really try to understand what's the local dynamic in that response.
Yeah, I would say sprinkle it with salt, everything that you're hearing, because, you know, I'll have people come up, oh, you know, I hear co-working is it's dying. Well, you know, in big cities, actually it's dying, but you know, what we're seeing in smaller communities is there seems to be a real keen interest in having some options because, you know, mom or dad are really tired of being at home with the kids and need a break for a few hours. So, you know, and then even a lot of you in Washington where you have a big metro, you know, the whole notion of, you know, it's a lot of this is based on big city stuff or big retail financial market stuff. And I know we can talk more about it. So.
Yep.
Yeah, and I did want to share in the chat, there are a couple of really good resources from National Main Street. One is a blog series that Matt has been putting out, and then the other is a good amount of research that National Main Street started really early on, especially looking at small businesses. So I'm going to use the chat right now to share those two links. You could open them and look through them after the webinar. But this is also an invitation that as questions come to you, please use the chat to submit them to us. We obviously want this to be as meaningful to all of you as possible. So please use that chat to submit questions. During the conversation, we'll for sure leave some time at the end as well. But, you know, one thing that you've both mentioned to me is that, you know, retail does look very different, maybe from what we see in the headlines. So realizing that there aren't necessarily full-fledged generalities that make sense right now. If you do look at kind of like what the media might mean when they're talking about retail in the headlines, and then look at what you know, the business mix and what retail looks like in a historic downtown commercial district that we work in, what are some of the differences you're seeing that maybe aren't in the headlines? Tripp, do you want to go after that?
Yeah, I'll share a few things on, let me see if I can do the best I can on what's in the headlines and then what's not in the headlines. So, you know, what's in the headlines, we keep hearing about the closure of chains, you know, these big chains, whether it's Tuesday Morning, J. Crew, you know, Lord & Taylor. I mean, the list goes on and on. And really part of that's because the national retail climate through ICSC and the real estate markets, that's just a whole animal unto itself. And what I love about what Matt is working on at the National Main Street Center is probably the definitive independent business district assessment data that we'll probably ever get, the best we can do. And so, am I kissing his butt too much? I do really think that, I think it's really important that when you see a headline, go to those links and double check, because the amount of data and response that Matt's getting is affirming, you know, some of what we're seeing on the trends. I'm going to talk about a couple things that are really important. You know, safety and hygiene looks like it's going to be a lasting trend, you know, and so if you can make people feel comfortable. We saw this after September 11th, the whole idea of nesting and staying closer to home, and localization and loyalty is actually increasing. And I think that's something that is not likely to disappear in the short term. And it gives a chance to really, really put Main Street in the forefront of, these are your neighbors, these are your locals, these are the ones that will keep you safe, these are the ones that will care for you. And so I think that's a really important thing to take away. And then certainly, you know, we're going to have to, if anything, do the best we can to help more be more sophisticated as far as online delivery. And online delivery, but I mean that in the broadest sense, you know, the online footprint, I just don't think we're going to see people backing off of that. And so as independents, that's going to be, and as Main Street programs, I think that's going to be really critically important. But I'd love to hear Matt's thoughts about it because he's been poring over the research. So.
Yeah, so I think, you know, there's a little bit of this pendulum thing, you know. We have this swing, and as Tripp mentioned early on, anytime there are sort of seismic shifts in the economy, you know, changes like 9/11, like the Great Recession, like the pandemic, you see this acceleration of trends that were already occurring. There's no doubt about that. And then consumers as well will adapt new sort of habits as a result of that. So pre-COVID, you know, certainly what we were seeing 2018, then through 2019, we were seeing the most closures of all time for retail businesses. But as you dig deep into that data, again, most of that was at the national level with national chains, and it was in specific markets. So we talk about retail, but we don't take that next level of what segment of retail. And all it was doing was following pathways of many other retail segments prior to that. It went from electronics, books, and then to apparel, department stores, shoes. If you look at the density of closures, they were concentrated within just a few of the retail segments that largely were commonly found in more suburban mall sort of segments, if anything. And then anytime that pendulum swings one way, it also swings back the other in terms of where opportunities lie. And what we see within the trend lines and new habit formations that have occurred through COVID, I think, also represent new opportunities within the retail landscape. So just like a business has a life cycle, retail also has a life cycle from a segmentation perspective as consumers change patterns and that sort of thing. So, you know, look at like health and wellness. We're all much more cognizant of sort of our own sort of, you know, how are we feeling? How are we doing? Eating better. Maybe I'm, you know, I planted a garden during this time period. That if you think about that sort of transition as people becomes more of a normal life, or like cooking from home, working from home, and noticing all the like problems with your home, all of that can actually lead to new retail segments for our main streets to sort of, you know, go into because there's now more market demand. Or trend lines like in recreation, what's been happening to the use of trail systems. Bike sales are through the roof. You know, just you can't even barely find a bike these days. The gamification of sports and recreation. You know, someone in a Peloton bike, you know, going down the Alps of France, you know, will that lead to new sort of ways that we go into fitness centers or gamification electronics stores? You know, all these kinds of things can lead to new sort of business opportunities on the other side as we see other closures that are tending to happen. And one last thing, and I think that's really important to this conversation, is you sort of look at these headlines, and this is in no means, Tripp and I aren't trying to say that there aren't challenges out there from a retail perspective, but I think we also need to drill down again in sort of these closures and what's happening on the e-commerce space. And I think one of the kind of indicators, the lead indicators out there, if you look at the last decade or so of what's really made, you know, downtown sort of hum, it's really been about this sort of dichotomy of shoppers between those looking at price and convenience and those interested in sort of experiential, unique, something that says it's something about you personally. What's my lifestyle? And that's sort of that leisure-based component of shopping. And so if you look at something like an Etsy, for example, on the e-commerce site, because, you know, most of the data that we could look at, you know, was sales that were occurring on e-commerce. And certainly e-commerce was going up because of the closures. But what was really fascinating is if you look at sales of Etsy, which kind of while I can't duplicate the experience of being in a downtown along the main street, the kinds of products of artists, makers, the uniqueness, the personalities that get brought out when you buy those kinds of products, that particular platform was far outpacing sales within just the general rate of increase in e-commerce. And so I think that what that suggests is that people still have that yearning. That hasn't gone away. That's not a new norm in terms of, going just strictly to e-commerce. People still want those kinds of products and services. It just didn't have the opportunity because of the pandemic and having the closures that we were under. So I fully anticipate that, once that goes back to some new normalcy of being able to shop in a bricks and mortar store, the consumers will still have those that kind of need, that kind of yearning for engagement with unique products and services.
Just quick things that come to mind as Matt was talking. The other thing that we're seeing is more local, travel. I think people are kind of yearning to travel. And again, I immediately, as I hear Matt talk and I think about Washington State, the whole idea of, even the gamification of this a little bit of, if I live in Washington State and I haven't been to Wenatchee, maybe that's part of what happens with main streets, is that we're doing a little bit of cross promotion of one another main streets to help populate hotels. Because if I live in South Carolina and except for Myrtle Beach, which I don't trust with a 10-foot pole, I trust being in the small towns in my state that I know are the ones that I know are taking care of things. Now, we're in a whole different ballgame than y'all in Washington. But that's one thing that came to mind. And I did share, I think this kind of a for what it's worth share. I mentioned McKinsey last week and what they're doing on some of the trend lines. And I just think this one is a really good macro look, because as you look at Matt's research, if you look at Matt's research, it dovetails very nicely with McKinsey's looking at these overall trends.
So,
Brian,
I saw comment. I'll paste those in there again. The resources from National Main Street too. A lot of what Matt's going into with the consumer sentiment is detailed even more in some of their work. There you go. Thanks, Trip. But one of the things I know you both wanted to talk about as well are real estate trends, not just retail and consumer. So what do you think is happening in that arena right now that might be different, especially as it might relate to Main Street opportunities? Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, so again, I think there's a little bit of segmentation that takes place. I mean, if you just look at housing remains incredibly strong. Unlike the Great Recession, this isn't sort of a mortgage issue, from that standpoint. So whether it's housing starts, again, unless you're in, like high density, like New York's pretty well getting hammered right now, from a leasing perspective. But overall, again, across the country, housing remains very, very strong. The office market, a little tough to say right now, because I don't think we've seen the full, the inline here. Again, nationally, some of the bigger, especially if you're in like the tech space, have talked about, going full remote and remaining remote. I think a lot of companies, I've seen forecasts of anywhere that, 40%, 42% of workforce won't return, will remain remote. We'll see how sticky that is. So I think, again, you have to localize these things. So, understand kind of what people are saying, and then ask the question, talk with your property owners, talk with your service businesses that are, in the sort of real estate space as well, to better understand how are they looking at this. So I think that's one point, just understand like what's the inventory looking like, what changes within your inventory. And then I think, the second part to the real estate side is going to be how do uses and functions change within space? How does COVID influence that? So we've always talked from a Main Street perspective about like facades and the exteriors in some ways have been the focal point. And I think what we'll see is some pivoting to like we need to focus on how the interiors might need to be reworked, how inventory gets sort of reassembled in spaces, how offices shift and change. Some people say, okay, office might decline, and maybe so. It's hard to say. But maybe the space dynamics won't necessarily because of social distancing and keeping, going back to maybe less open office to more closed, who knows? So, I think it's one of those things where you have to localize it, see what your businesses are thinking, and then adjust. But I certainly think there'll probably be some additional like technical assistance needs from a Main Street perspective on the interiors.
And boy, you're to my geek zone here, and I'm going to use a little bit of a stump speech, and Matt's teed up really well. This separation of suburban retail and suburban real estate with downtown real estate is stark. Most of our suburban commercial properties are by and large held with real estate investment trusts, which year to date on the whole are down 24%. The leading trailers, hotels are down 58% year to date. Real estate trusts that own malls are down 53%. Shopping centers 45%. When you look at things like, housing, they're just down a smidge. Well, real estate investment trusts, if y'all have one that owns your downtown or a big chunk of it, I apologize in advance, but you're in rarefied air. Almost all of our downtowns are locally owned buildings and businesses. And so if there was ever a time for businesses to renegotiate leases, for building owners to renegotiate terms with their banks, banks do not want to own these buildings. Banks do not want to take over these businesses. This is the time for those conversations to open the door on how those things may be modified and work better. And I think everything said, I'm going to just say ditto, ditto, ditto on the spaces, because I think that's an important consideration as well.
Are there any creative uses that
apples and oranges, suburban retail is an orange, downtowns are apples, or whatever your fruit du jour is, but it is Washington. So let's make downtown the apples and we'll make suburban the oranges.
Well, are there any, when we were talking the other day, Tripp, you mentioned Ellensburg's Hotel Windrow model in terms of real estate development. Are those, and please feel free to give more information on that sort of as a case study, but are there more opportunities for more localized investment teams like that in this moment?
I emphatically believe that there are. And this is based on what I keep hearing from colleagues. Just personal conversation. A lot of this is anecdotal, but more and more people are asking the question, and we're talking about accelerating trends. And I think we touched on it a little bit last week. We hemmed and hawed for a long time, waiting on the Jobs Act and the SEC to clarify the rules for local vesting and small, not being a qualified investor and not having to go through the REITs, not having to go through this stuff. And what COVID is doing is really pushing, my gosh, why don't we get together, and do some of these things? And so there's some great folks in some communities that they're buying real estate and renovating because they're jumping now, because it's an opportunity to do it. So I firmly believe that's an opportunity to explore.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, I think, we were seeing bits and pieces of that, sort of these community investment pools, if you want to call them that. And if anything, if we just, again, if you sort of look at like indicators, and these are more anecdotal than data driven, but if you just look across the country and what local communities stepped up in support of small businesses and began pooling dollars together and resources, using their CARES Act funding to support, that I think that there is a hyper awareness from a community perspective of the importance of small businesses and of downtowns that resulted. I think there's a little bit of fear. Do we want an Amazon only environment where that's all that's left? Do we want to be like anywhere sort of USA? And I just think that there's a profound answer of no. That's the small businesses. It's those historic properties that give character, that give identity, that give uniqueness to, and sort of why you choose where you live, why you choose where you put your business. And that is coming across in data that we'll share hopefully over the next series of weeks. But if anything, what that suggests is that people will be willing to make those investments and come together outside of like traditional sort of real estate investment tools.
Are there any specific models that you would recommend local Main Street programs on this webinar look at, or resources so they can learn more about these types of investment models so they can advise and try to enhance that ethic in their community?
I'll probably need to pull a link, and Matt may have one at his fingertips. I do a lot of work in Vermont as well. And really, the state of Vermont is a pioneer in community-supported enterprises. You can't go to a small town there without a co-op grocery store. And so there's a lot of great research out of Vermont on community-supported enterprises. And I would say that's a good place to look. And what I'll try and do is look for some links to share on that. And then I'll throw one other thing on. Every state's handling this a little differently. And, one of the things Vermont is doing through the CARES Act is their governor and legislature is giving every Vermont resident a gift card to shop in a local business. It's coming in the mail, and they're rechargeable. And so what's going to happen likely is that if it goes well, they're going to recharge those gift cards back up, and it'll just kind of be autopilot. And they're encouraging Vermonters to shop locally, and they are teaming with tourism to actually promote staycation across the state of Vermont. Astounding stuff. Keep in mind, every state's a little different. In Vermont, the governor will come to your birthday party if you invite him. So getting Governor Inslee to come to your birthday party may be a little different in Washington. So
I echo Ellen in the comments. Wow, Vermont.
Vermont's got it going on, I guess. I would only, so I think, one that comes to mind is like Perry, New York. If you just do a search under Perry, New York LLC, I see a lot of communities that, and again, I don't think this is necessarily new. I think it's just sort of the risk-taking nature of some communities being a little bit more proactive, because there's no special sort of legislation that's pushing some of these tools outside of like the SEC kind of Jobs Act that was put in place. But you can formalize a simple investment pool with an LLC, a real estate LLC. Some community members coming together. I mean, foundations can put money into those tools. Private sector versus individuals. You can group within a real estate LLC to put a pool together and have some decisions. Even nonprofits can be owners within those particular pools, and use that as a way to direct investment to key catalytic projects that are being identified. So it doesn't have to be overly complex. It can just be getting a gang of folks together that are interested in doing it, putting some legalities to it, and making those investments. So there are complex structures, but you can simplify it as well.
Well, and we could spend days on this topic because it is so interesting. Is there any resource from National Main Street, Matt, to give sort of more of this 101 on this topic?
Well, I think, I guess I'd have to go like into the resource section. I'm sure we've published something along those particular lines.
Up with attendees with some of these links. So as Tripp and I and Matt are posting things in the chat, don't feel an overwhelming sense of pressure to capture them. We will follow up with you.
The only other thing I would mention is another organization that might be helpful in looking at some of these things, and that's the Incremental Development Alliance. That really focuses on sort of
on Google the whole time. I'm not
their focus really is, kind of the mom and pop, developer. And so, they have resources as well. And so, we can certainly be, but I mean, there's groups out there, and they're really good groups. And I think Incremental Development Alliance is one of those.
And some of the women developers that are involved in Incremental Development Alliance are my new superheroes. Bernice Radley from I mean, she is just phenomenal. So I just posted the link. Oh, Brianne did it too. So I would say looking at both of those are really good. And I got to tell you, the people involved in Incremental Development Alliance, they're probably one of the just really down to earth and no BS talkers, which is really cool.
Yeah, I love that. And I think what I'm kind of hearing wholesale here from you both is that, if I may, changes in the air. Some of these trends were started, but now might be a moment to really push them forward. So with that in mind, are there other ways that you are hoping that Main Streets will think about economic development in terms of their role in it? Maybe there's some research you want to refer to there, but as we really kind of own the fact that economic development is and always has been our work, what do you hope that Main Streets really focus on in terms of recovery over the next months and years? Matt, I know you probably have a major vision on that from National Main Streets perspective.
Well, I guess like two things. One, more of a philosophy than a tactical kind of thing. I mean, Main Streets, and if you think about like small businesses as well, to me, we've always been at the forefront of change. We've had to be. Competition has been tough, and we haven't always had the resources or capacity that some of these major players obviously have. So we've had to be nimble, we've had to be flexible, we've had to be creative, we've had to be innovative. And I think at this particular time with the challenges, that bodes well, because that's what it takes when you're trying to not only pivot a business model as a small business owner, but when you're trying to pivot a community, and when you're trying to pivot, a downtown or a shopping district, it takes that kind of thinking. So, I would just press us to be much more in the line of being entrepreneurial ourselves, to try things. Now's the time to experiment. If you fail, okay, that's the nature of the beast. Or if it's not perfect, don't let that be the enemy of getting out with something that's good. If it's 80%, do it. You can always come back like a software company with version 2.1, that's the expectation. So I think philosophically, mindset, I think that's critical. That's what leadership is all about, is having that particular mindset to try. So that's one point. And then sort of on the economic development side of the equation, I just sense that, what will be upon us, and rather quick. In fact, I was just telling Tripp and Brianne, I was on a call with Maine before this, and talking with some of the SBDC folks, and they're already starting to see this. But historically, when we've had times of high unemployment during, and certainly the Great Recession being the most recent time, nowhere near the profound unemployment that we see today, there's always been this sort of lag period then at which some people will go back to work, but some people won't. And those people will largely try to transition their skills, their backgrounds, their experiences into some form of entrepreneurship. And I think we need to be prepared for that. That is while it is a bad thing that's happening, with people being out of work, it's also an opportunity. And so I think if anything, is we're pivoting from a sort of an activity perspective, I think we should be mindful of what are we doing? What's our role within that sort of ecosystem that supports local entrepreneurs? And how can we create and identify the best places, the best sort of programming pipelines, whether that's pop-ups or shared space in an existing store, to contest and allocating incentives or resources for those kinds of activities, so those entrepreneurs find a new home in your particular downtown. I think it's a great opportunity that's forthcoming.
I think the only thing I would add to that, because that's so comprehensive, is to reinforce what Matt just said on, we are at a point now with Main Street where I think our communities are going to be very forgiving of, if it's a 60% or a 70%, or we tried it and it didn't work, and I would say don't let anything pre-COVID, we tried it and didn't work, stop you from trying it again. And then also, if you try something and it doesn't work, as long as you kind of say it doesn't work, let's move on to the next thing, or how do we massage it so it does work?
Yeah, I really humble. Like that. Yeah. Well, and Matt, you said it really well. It's the kind of the combination of being entrepreneurial yourself as an organization, but then also focusing on entrepreneurs that are very well likely already in your community. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, but did you tell me that you have some data that shows that like a 3/4 of entrepreneurs are probably already in the community? Can you elaborate on that?
So in our newest survey, and we'll expand on that, but early sort of look at the data suggests that nearly 3/4 of all small businesses come from within. They weren't recruited from the outside, that kind of thing. They live there, and so again, cultivate from within. It's a much higher return on investment. It's a lot easier to do. They already know the community, they know the pitfalls, they know the advantages, and many times they're kind of hidden. It's amazing, how many might be on Etsy or operating out of their homes. And I think that's another thing that we may see is again the challenge of having some vacancies, or maybe a restaurant here and there going out. That's also an opportunity perhaps for like a small scale, producer to come in and then operate out of that kitchen that wasn't, is very challenging for those people to scale, or that small business owner or that entrepreneur to have, some shared space opportunities. So I think having some flexibility in how we view sort of retail tenancy going forward. I think there's going to be a lot of like new hybrids that get created as a result of this. I think we don't have to look at it from the same lens that we looked at it from January, February of 2020. I think we should be experimental and see what works.
So we're at about 9:45. I want to remind people that if you do have questions for Tripp and Matt, please use the chat. But with the time that we do have left with you, a big part of what I wanted to ask is, what are some of the tactics you recommend, getting down to the details if you want, for a Main Street program to respond to some of these ideas, some of these opportunities? And the first one I'd like to ask you about is, you've both kind of talked about localizing data and trends. Can you give a little bit more detail on how a Main Street program might approach that, including, I know we talked the other day about talking with small business owners. So Tripp, do you want to kind of get into that piece of it first?
Yeah, I think this is a really important piece to talk about, is especially with, economic, I'm sorry, I always get it. The Economic Development, Economic Restructuring Committee, economic stability, not the director, not the coordinator. Get the committee working on this. Make the phone calls to the business owners. Divide up. Figure out, who has relationships with who. And I think that's really important. And then bear in mind the importance of, when you make those phone calls, having some degree of a framework of questions where you can begin to collect what we call thin data. And so if you're asking the questions, and I saw a comment earlier today about businesses are reluctant sometimes to admit that it's going okay or it's stable or whatever. So if they're able to, if your committee members are able to collect that data and you start figuring out, we keep hearing this over and over again, that's the kind of data that you want to be able to act on. And so sometimes we think these phone calls are just conversations. But if you're careful about documenting them and you make enough of them locally, you can actually turn that into actionable data because of what you're hearing and what you're learning. So that's just one suggestion. I think there's many more.
Yeah, and I'm going to respond. I saw something pop up on the chat, and I thought it was just a really good question, and one that's I think present mind given the dynamics and this need. I think we find ourselves as and I say ourselves, you guys in the trenches working with small businesses every day, and kind of your role perhaps pivoting as well and shifting. You know, we're finding ourselves in kind of a unique position where again, maybe we were heavy in promotional events and those kinds of things, and that's where our sort of strength and our knowledge base has been. And you know, what COVID has shown is that we're being thrust, and I think that's an opportunity, of course, into, you know, being a small business counselor, understanding sort of the role of real estate now more dramatically, how to fill vacancies perhaps, or how to cultivate new entrepreneurs, you know, in our communities, how to put financial programs together, whether direct to small business or for real estate. These are perhaps things that were always within the confines of a Main Street program, but perhaps we weren't as you know, as much working in those particular areas. And so from a skill set perspective, you know, I would encourage, there's some great programs I think can add to that. And I will just say, I was a journalism undergrad, folks. Like I didn't know anything about economic development back in 1991 when I became a Main Street manager. Oh my God, I just aged myself. Sorry, folks. Again, I was a journalism undergrad, okay? But there are some great programs out there, professional development that you can go to if you're interested in becoming more attuned to that. The National Development Council, for example, has great programming, and we do a historic real estate finance course with them that you have an opportunity. There's usually scholarships for those. So if you want to learn more about the real estate, the nuts and bolts of that, to small business finance, the International Economic Development Council, if you want to learn more just about general economic development, has what they call EDI, the Economic Development Institute. We have, you know, Main Street America, the Institute there, if you want to just pop in for an online course and learn more about that, or go to the community transformation workshop. So I think there's lots of opportunities. So I think hopefully push on your boards that even though times are, you know, are challenging from a resource, that professional development in order to pivot is needed. It's much like a company that needs to make research and development a priority in order to have new products in the pipeline. Your product, we need you in that pipeline, and we need to invest in our leadership in order for them to play that role that's so needed. So I think that's sort of critical. And I'll stop there, you know, from a tactical perspective. I just think that professional development is so critical for us to be able to play that leadership role that's going to be needed.
I'm so glad that came up. Thanks for that question, Alan. Go ahead, Tripp. What were you going to say?
The thing I'll chime in on that is I completely agree with everything Matt said, with a but. And the but is, if you're going to, you know, to IEDC, or you're going to some of these other sources, and you're 5 minutes into the training and you haven't heard a word of English that you understand yet, you're in the wrong economic development training. And I'm an English major, and so crunching the numbers and doing economic development comes to me kind of the same way it comes to Matt. This is kind of a self-trained thing. And so a lot of the quote professional economic developers, they come through a lens of industrial recruitment and all that. And so you'll know really quickly whether the training you're receiving is for you. And I've been training South Carolina's Economic Development, Institute for years. And what's been great for me is when I started doing it years ago, I mean, literally I was like, Main Street's not just trees and flowers, to now know that it's big business and it means something, but you still find a lot of that old stuff. And so just be in tune to that, and you'll know it as soon as you see it,
Great
and
point.
move on to the next session.
Yeah, wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah, so glad that came up. Thank you both for that. I agree with everything you both said there. The question came in about very small towns and described as those without a comma in their population numbers. Are there any tactics that you've seen in your work across the nation from very small towns in terms of supporting businesses?
Yeah, so, it's funny doing some of that work in Maine where we have, there's certainly lots of rural communities there. I think, some of this is also about creating kind of like virtual systems. I think we have this rush to like, we need to build something that takes lots of capacity and resources. And sometimes you can get the resources to build it, but you can't necessarily sustain it because you got an operation cost. So I think there's a lot of sort of virtual nature to this. And then also, just thinking more along the lines of what's the regional context. Again, this parochialism sometimes gets in the way of our ability to share resources and capacity amongst kind of, like type communities that if we just sort of combined efforts, we could then jointly support some of these initiatives. So I think we've got to be able to break down some of those barriers because otherwise it's difficult. Even if you can scale things, it's still difficult without those needed resources.
And the towns without the commas are the ones sometimes where those divides are even, I won't say stronger, but I've experienced where, I'm working in a community that's 800 people, and there's a resort there. There's a nonprofit foundation that runs summer camps all summer, and there's the town government. I started working with them before COVID. The first time the resort owners, the foundation leadership, and the town government have ever sat at the table together to discuss anything was when I convened a round table with them. And it was, I was just sitting there going, oh my gosh, and so, COVID is amplifying that need to tear down some of those barriers, even in small towns where, sometimes you have silos that we think of them very often in big communities, but in small towns, they tend to kind of be that way too. So tearing that down if you can.
And that is a great role for a Main Street to, sorry, Matt, I'm just saying that's, being the conveners is oftentimes one of the highest purposes a Main Street program can serve in terms of economic development. What were you going to say, Matt?
I was just going to say, thing pops in your mind a little bit later, but but I think it's even more probably important, especially in small towns, to kind of better understand sort of your uniqueness. It's easy to kind of follow what everyone else is doing. And I think when you have limited resources and capacity, understand, what are your key drivers? What are your assets? Do some mapping in that regard, and then really hone in on that. What makes you special? What makes you unique within sort of your, sort of broader marketplace, and focus on that. If you only have so many, things to fire, aim towards what's going to probably give you the greatest return.
Before we run out of time, I want to address one other really tactical question from Walla Walla. They've done an incredible job with an open streets concept and with areas for restaurants to benefit. And Catherine is asking, are there any specific suggestions on how to invest CARES dollars to benefit retailers? Because that seems like not that their area was easy, but it feels like a less clear solution for how to help retailers.
I'll start on that one, and I hope I'm not sounding repetitive from last week because I'm doing a lot of sessions and I may be saying the same thing over. In Alabama, they're doing a grant program for retailers that provides them plexiglass separators for those who need it, door foot pulls for doors for entries and exits, the spacers for, is a COVID related, grant for those retailers. The other piece I think we got down this road a little bit last week as we talked is thinking too of blending some of what you're doing to expand the dining between retail and restaurants. And maybe that's an opportunity to get diners in retail spaces that as the weather turns, we haven't done before. And that
what
can
do you
help.
mean by that?
So a dining room table set up in a retailer next to the restaurant, or a large format store that has merchandise that can be rearranged to create a cafe space to expand dining opportunities. So let's just say my family wants to go out in a downtown. Well, you want to go to the sushi place and I want to go to the Mexican place. Well, hey, the antique mall has got, a open hall now, up front. I mean, just really rethinking how some of that goes on repositioning things.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I think that concept of almost like a call it like a virtual shared food court is something that's we're gonna start to see doing some pop-up, right? To create the necessary spatial components that you need for dining is how can you utilize other space that perhaps you don't own, and then everyone uses it collectively. Yeah, I think that's definitely something on the horizon.
Yeah, that's cool.
I would only say in New Jersey, they just passed, it hasn't been announced, in fact, yet, it's coming, but where the state is using CARES Act funding that will flow through Main Street programs and be able to be utilized in support of sort of the physical environment aspects of retailing, to work on alleyway conversions to putting out like gas, propane gas burners for outdoor dining and, colder weather situations, to supplies that are needed for retailing, as well as for some TA technical services around like business pivoting, model pivots for small businesses. So I think that's coming down the pipeline as well.
Thank you both. That gives us a lot to think about for sure. And I wanted to share one quick thing from the chat. It's not a question, but in relation to Trip, what you were saying about talking with small business owners and gathering some of that feedback from them, but also helping them feel supported. In Canvas, they have board members that are assigned to specific I think blocks in their downtown. And I love how Carrie said this. It shows that they have a bench that actively cares about their success. So they're going to continue using sort of that block captain model, which I know other Main Streets do as well. And a great way of getting other volunteers, other leaders involved in that support, but also that sort of softer data collection you're referring to. We are at time here, so I wanted to give both of you an opportunity for any closing thoughts and a thank you very much for everything you've shared with us today. Trip, is there any sort of big picture last thought you want us to walk away with?
Well, I think the theme of these three sessions has been kind of moving from crisis to recovery, and this really is the time to move into that oh my God, we're reacting to that proactive mode. And that's what I love seeing in the chats too, is everything that people are bringing up, the questions they're asking, it's not reactionary, it's proactive. It's like, okay, we did this, now how do we do that? Or we're doing this and we think we're gonna continue it. That's the mindset we have got to be in right now.
Yeah, I'd only conclude in sort of along those same lines that I think mindset is as important, and actually probably more important than data and all those kinds of things. And again, hyper-local. Understand what's going on in your own community. Certainly understand the trends, the sort of the macro stuff, but adapt it and scale it to what's going to work in your own community.
Thank you both so much. I actually have a toddler downstairs who's playing us our exit music right now on the piano. I don't know if you can hear it, but I'd say that's a great way to end this. Thank you both so much for everything you're doing for our entire network right now. As you've been able to see in the chat, I hope, we really appreciate your insight and everything you're doing to support the folks on the ground right now. And so the next and final of our 3-part webinar series with the two of you and with Norma, we'll bring her back for this one, is going to focus more on the tactical side of it. How do we plan? Now that we've tried to shift our mindset, now that we have some more understanding of the economic situation that we're in and the opportunities around that, what do we do with that? So I hope you'll all join us same time, same place next Thursday for a final conversation with Matt, Tripp, and Norma about planning. Thanks everyone for being with us today.